I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope now everyone can hear me all right. I hope that this microphone issue has been fixed. For what it's worth, I am seeing movement on my screen, but we are going to be, with our third segment, continuing with our positional rankings here. Continuing talking about the fantasy position coming up in Week 8 of the NFL season with our running backs, who historically had very good performances this past week. A lot of fascinating performances to dissect from last week, and I could go on and on about who I really like this week, but the four guys I have selected for this week all had decent performances. Some had bye weeks, though. But at the end of the day, these are the guys who I personally expected before I saw this week's games to perform at high levels. As Michael Chapp asks, what's Olave's value in terms of an RB2? I do feel that if I'm understanding you correctly, you're kind of to interpret a trade here in terms of how you can trade away Chris Olave, a player who a lot of people are willing to sell high. I feel like there are a lot of RB2 options out there who can provide depth to your team. For example, no better place than, unfortunately, I don't think many of you heard this, but in my last segment talking about the Bucs. A very deep running back room there, a lot of versatility in it, in terms of the Colts as well. Now guys like Sermon and Goodson are going to get a lot more touches too. So if you're looking in terms of trade value and understanding the worth of Chris Olave, I do think there are options either via trade or through the waiver wire that can really help you if you're looking to sell him high. But that's just my opinion. Good luck to you in your fantasy football exploits. But looking at this running back position for this week, a lot of interesting guys, but the four ones I want to dive into here, starting off with someone who really had to kind of step up and really still will continue to have to step up for as long as one of his teammates is out, in Joe Mixon, against a Colts team who I think he can do very well against one of the worse run defenses in the league. Now, in terms of how to view this running back situation here in Texas, I feel like Joe Mixon is someone who's going to really carry a lot of the load. We've seen Dameon Pierce and Cam Akers have good moments in this offense, but for the time being, for as long as Nico Collins is out, it's the Joe Mixon show. And really the best moments of this Houston Texans offense has come from the opportunities Joe Mixon gets in the run game. And it all will depend as well on the offensive line of Houston. They have some good offensive linemen, some of the best ones in the league, but in terms of run scheme, in terms of blocking for the run, I still think they need to shore up a little bit, because if they want to be a run-heavier team in the absence of Collins, they need better protection for guys like Mixon, Pierce, and Akers. But I do think Mixon will have a good game, perhaps the best fantasy performer for Houston in this one, the 26.4 fantasy points. But at the end of the day, I do feel like, he is someone who I guarantee you will week in, week out be a viable fantasy asset. The second guy I want to talk about is someone who played last night and whose value might be skyrocketing over these next couple of weeks, as the Bucs have a very difficult stretch ahead for them and definitely need someone to step up. How about Bucky Irving stepping up? In the last game against the Falcons, obviously had a huge fumble that completely turned this game on its head, and not for nothing, had a decent showing against Baltimore last night, 16.7 fantasy points, better on the receiving end of things rather than the rushing side of things. But in this Bucks running back room, there's been no more dynamic player, in my opinion, than Bucky Irving. I think that White had a lot of good plays last night, but he's someone who's more of a first down back. If you're looking for someone who can extend the play, someone who understands his role in this offense, most importantly, is perhaps the best receiving back in this backfield, it's Bucky Irving. Against the Falcons, the running back depth for both of these teams will be the story, in my opinion. And so, not for nothing, with the absence of Evans and Godwin, you need, if you're the Bucks, someone to step up. Because Atlanta's defense kind of got rocked against Seattle this week, but I still think they're better than the sum of their parts and what they showed at home against Seattle. But I do think that Bucky Irving is still someone to be valuable, someone who you may have picked up off the waiver wire and had a bit of qualms about, but I still think he's going to be very consistent, especially now given the dire straits the Bucks are in. That's just my opinion about him. Let me know if there are other guys you would like to see step up from a fantasy perspective in this Bucks offense, but really, I'm looking at this running back room to carry them. I still value Baker because he can be unhinged in these kind of situations where he just throws all caution to the wind and just goes out there and tries to be himself. But I do think if they're able to bring out the best traits in all three of these running backs, they can find consistency and maintain it in this offense. And then let's talk about a running back who, like I said, was on a bye this week. DeAndre Swift, kind of been on a heater these past couple of weeks from a fantasy perspective. As someone who picked him with the draft, I was a little apprehensive about him, knowing his history, knowing that while he has had good seasons throughout his career, he has bounced around certain teams, and finding himself in Chicago, not necessarily the best of situations for, say, a running back, but over these past 3 weeks, really showing up for this offense. And it's going to be integral for this playoff push the Bears feel like they can have down the stretch here in their more manageable schedule. So, look for DeAndre Swift to still be effective. This is a big game that could move the barometer for me in terms of how I view the Bears going up against the Commanders. And, yes, the Commanders, obviously not the best defensive team, and their defensive performances that have been good have come against teams like the Panthers last week. So I can't take much stock in what DeAndre Swift will be able to do against a defense like the Commanders. But I do feel like if Jaden Daniels doesn't play, all the pressure will be off the Bears and on the Commanders. So look for DeAndre Swift and co. to take advantage of that. And I do feel like Caleb, even though he will perhaps be the far superior quarterback from a talent perspective in this game if Mariota plays, will sometimes have to lean on a guy like DeAndre Swift to break down a Commander's defense in terms of getting him comfortable and have him mature throughout the game and prove that he was the right choice for them, because this potentially was going to be a matchup of the number 1 versus number 2 picks, but that's up in the air right now. And so it's going to be on his secondary weapons, and also for Mariota if he starts as well, but more so for Caleb to step up, and DeAndre Swift has been doing it these past couple of weeks and has been someone the Bears can rely upon in their rise in the NFC. So hopefully after a bye, getting a couple weeks rest, coming back from London after that game against the Jags where they looked their most impressive, acclimating back to, the American body clock, hopefully they'll be ready to go against Washington, because Washington, no matter who's playing quarterback, looks pretty ready as a contender in the NFC. But I digress. The last running back that I want to talk about had a little bit of an injury this past week against Minnesota. Did not necessarily play as much or as well as a lot of people were expecting in this game, but still someone who I really think is still one of the better fantasy running back options out there, and that is David Montgomery. Only had 8 fantasy points, kind of let Jahmyr Gibbs run the show in the backfield after, the little injury mishap that befell him. But I do think that if he's healthy, he is still the guy they're going to go to out of the backfield there in Detroit. I think that Jahmyr Gibbs is someone who can hold it down. It's kind of the anchor of that backfield in certain situations, like he showed against Minnesota. But David Montgomery, as Andre said, Puka is back. Big news for fantasy football managers, Los Angeles Rams fan, and Matthew Stafford alike. But I did not expect that news to come as Andre said, my fantasy team is going to be unstoppable. I did not expect this news to come out as soon. I thought perhaps, from what I heard, Puka might be sitting out another week. But that is fantastic news. Kudos to you for pointing it out. Kudos to you for your fantasy team getting stronger. And yeah, I'm really excited to see how Puka reintegrates himself back into what could begin to become an exciting Rams offense. But going back into David Montgomery to kind of close out my segment here, I do feel like David Montgomery gets a little under-respected just because of how potent the Detroit Lions offense is. But at the end of the day, he is the engine room of what the Detroit Lions do, so to speak. His injury obviously didn't impact them that much just because Jahmyr Gibbs had a career day, but he still is someone who, if you're a fantasy manager and was worried a little bit about his injury, in this matchup against the Titans, not necessarily the best of run defenses, still a decent defense, but can be exploited. Look for him to want to wear them down early and often. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, because it's an interesting situation. But coming up on the other side, I continue with my positional rankings here with my wide receivers. A lot of interesting options out there. Again, a lot of guys potentially on the bye, but a lot of guys also who I'm expecting breakout performances from. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We're in the home stretch of today's show. Sorry to all those who tuned in a little bit earlier with the mic issues. It seems like we are all fixed in that regard to continue with our fourth segment of the day here on the show with my positional rankings, my wide receivers. Not necessarily as good a week as the running backs had, but still some notable fantasy wide receiver performances nonetheless this week. And the four I've selected had their peaks and valleys this week. A lot of electrifying talent here, but it's just a matter of matchups, whether or not they perform on the day. Again, as always, I wrote these down. As Andre said, I doubt he plays Thursday, though, on a short week. That is a good point, obviously referring to Puka Nacua. But I do think he does, when he comes back, add a lot of upside to what this offense is missing. Because it's missing, a guy who's just a pure route runner and can get open for you on second and manageable, third and manageable situations. So he will be a huge addition or reintegration for both the Rams offense and your fantasy football squad. But talking about these four wide receivers here, these are four guys who, like I said, peaks and valleys, but based off the matchups, again, looking at them before this past week's games were even played, I like them a lot. And so without further ado, let's talk about them a little bit. Starting off with a guy who really has been perhaps the most peaks and valleys out of all these guys this season in terms of his play and the play of his offense. Drake London. I feel like, he had a decent game against Seattle, obviously had that short touchdown, 18.2 fantasy points, but the reason why I wasn't necessarily impressed by his performance is because of the fact that when you're the Falcons offense and Kirk Cousins has his limitations, you really need to be aware of how defenses play him in certain situations. On third down, especially later in the game, especially in the fourth quarter, I don't think the Falcons wide receivers, especially Drake London, really created enough separation for Kirk Cousins to throw the football comfortably. And as a result, he turned the ball over. And thus, that's why I feel Drake London's importance is integral to the success of the Atlanta Falcons going forward, especially in this game against the Bucs. Last game against the Bucs, Drake London had a decent performance as well in that one, but this one has to be much more important, much more intentional, and most importantly, a performance that best protects Kirk Cousins as well, because that game was the blueprint of how to slow down the Falcons' offense for different defenses around the leagues, looking at what Seattle did. Seattle took advantage of Kirk Cousins' limitations as a runner, and thus that was how Seattle was able to blow them out in the fashion that they did. But going into this game, I do feel like the difference will be the skill position players for both of these teams, and I still think right now the Falcons have the better ones, not for nothing, of course, with the Evans and Godwin's injuries. But I do feel like Drake London will have a good performance in this one to kind of bolster faith in him throughout fantasy football circles that he can be a high-end guy. But the second guy I want to talk about in this situation is a guy who consistently, when he's healthy, has been one of the best wide receivers and fantasy wide receivers in the league in a very interesting matchup here. A.J. Brown going up against the Bengals. What can we say about this guy? When he's healthy, when he plays, he just adds a different dimension to what the Eagles do on offense. Because, yes, the Eagles are Saquon Barkley-centric, right? And he's carrying them. This past game was against the Giants. A lot of different emotions there. But at the end of the day, A.J. Brown is really what makes this offense tick in my mind because of how he stretches the field. And if Jalen Hurts regains that trust in his deep ball, like we saw a little bit against New York, this Eagles offense will become that much more scary. And in a very intriguing matchup with the Bengals, where the Bengals have had a very poor defensive start, but in that game against Cleveland, saw some positives, and now have won 3 straight games due to their defense doing just enough to supplement what their offense has been doing. I still think A.J. Brown is the X factor for both teams and how this game will pan out. Because if the Eagles can put up points on the board, the Bengals will feel like they have to play catch-up, which is what they've been doing with other teams. So look for Jalen Hurts and A.J. Brown's connection this week to really be the key to success for the Eagles, potentially for him in your fantasy football squad if you choose to start him, because he's a very interesting prospect. As Henri also asked me, do I start Reed against Jacksonville or Neighbors against Pittsburgh? That's an interesting question. Both very favorable matchups here. But I do feel like, funnily enough, Neighbors is someone who actually will get a lot of targets still, in my opinion. And I don't think that will change going forward. I know it's funny to say because Pittsburgh has the better defense and the Giants' offense has looked putrid, to say the least, but they're still going to rely on Neighbors to really elevate his game to really help better Daniel Jones. And so I can't ignore, the fact that it's a little bit of the weirder matchup, but it's still what the Giants want to do. And not for nothing, Reed is in a situation where we know how good he is. But is he going to get the necessary amount of touches to win you a fantasy football game? And I think the answer is no, even against a pretty atrocious Jacksonville secondary. So I'm kind of begrudgingly going to say Neighbors. I know it's kind of weird to say, kind of the uglier pick, but I still think that Neighbors is someone who's going to get a lot of looks, whereas Reed, his kind of status is always up in the air considering the depth of the Green Bay wide receiver room. But overall, very interesting question. Thank you for it. And I hope it makes your decision a little bit easier, even though I gave you the harder option to kind of deal with. But going back to my personal wide receivers here, I think A.J. Brown is always an option that you have to account for in terms of his style, in terms of what he does for this Eagles offense, and most importantly, how dangerous he looks. But the third guy I want to talk about had a very quiet night. And I don't think it's through any fault of his own. He did have some nice routes, but at the end of the day, I think this was mainly him coming back from that concussion and simply not, having his full head in the game. No pun intended there. Marvin Harrison Jr. And he only had 5.1 fantasy points last night, but like I said, it wasn't entirely his fault. I think what he needs to continue to do is just run the routes he's running, and Kyler will find him. Now, there was the issue where there were a couple of routes early in the season where he was wide open. There were some last night as well. But this is more a question of whether or not, they wanted him to be in a little bit more of a limited role coming back from injury, or just because, the Arizona Cardinals took what the Chargers defense gave them, because not for nothing, the Chargers defense was pretty good in terms of defending the pass by Kyler Murray. Kyler only had 145 passing yards to prove that point. So, against the Dolphins secondary, who is slowly coalescing, but not necessarily a secondary that I have much faith in, against a weapon like Marvin Harrison, expect Marvin Harrison to continue doing what he's been doing and look for Kyler Murray to find him a little bit more often in this situation, because he is someone who I really love at the end of the day as someone in a fantasy setting who week in and week out will grow and mature as he continues his season, and if he stays healthy, most importantly as well. And then the final receiver that I wanted to talk about before we take our break is another rookie receiver, perhaps his best game of the season abroad in London. And he is someone who I feel like will get a lot of flack, interestingly enough. And here's why. Because he is someone who the Jags drafted with a purpose, and that purpose was to bring out the best traits in Trevor Lawrence. This season definitely is not going to plan, but he's seen glimpses of what this kid can be in terms of if Trevor Lawrence is performing well. And so Brian Thomas Jr. is an interesting proposition, and this is his toughest test to date. In fact, the Jaguars have one of the tougher schedules of anyone in the NFL coming up. So Brian Thomas Jr. will have a very hard task of really helping elevate Trevor Lawrence's game here. But what we see from him in this offense is someone who can stretch the field, someone who can make those hard catches, and most importantly, someone who does bring out the best in Trevor Lawrence, because like it or not, Trevor Lawrence's best asset is actually that deep ball, one of the better deep ball throwers in the league statistically throughout his years in the league. So I do feel like Brian Thomas Jr. is someone who you can't necessarily underrate in certain situations because of his verticality. Now, the danger here is the Packers are a team that now has proven to me that their secondaries just aren't all takeaways. They can defend on islands. They can defend in zone coverage. They are perhaps the best secondary right now in the National Football League. So the danger here in taking a risk on someone like Brian Thomas is not seeing the benefits be reaped because of the fact that Alexander McKinney and that defense has been so good. But he is getting an easier assignment. facing Eric Sosa, we'll talk about in our next segment. But, it's just one where I feel like he's coming into his own, and I feel like the tenor of the Jags offense is becoming one where you could see a lot more deep shots from both of these teams. But let me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming up to conclude today's show is, of course, my weekly Shadow Report, the key wide receiver cornerback matchups I feel will define the week in fantasy football. To close out today's show, don't go anywhere, guys. We will be right back with a banger to close this show. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it should be a good one of my favorite segments of doing this show here, my weekly Shadow Report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups will define the week in fantasy sports, and this is kind of a Shadow Report first here. Most of these matchups that I'm going to discuss, I believe, are first-time matchups. All but one of these matchups has happened before. It's hard to believe myself, I think, but it just goes to show that sometimes in the league, certain things don't come about until, when the moment's ready. Some of these matchups are between very young players, and it will really go to show the tenor of how the NFL is changing if some of these players win their respective matchups. But these are the four unquestionably biggest matchups of the weekend, in my opinion, that I found. Without further ado, let's jump right into them. Starting off with the only one that I believe has happened before, as you can see on my screen here, Terry McLaurin versus Jalen Johnson. Now, this one is a highly intriguing one just because Terry McLaurin, through experience alone, should have the edge. But the Bears secondary, man, this is a secondary that I've been singing their praises all season. And not for nothing, Jalen Johnson might be the best one. Was a Pro Bowler last year. A guy who really is very rangy, is a great communicator for this secondary, and someone who will try and stand up to the challenge the best he can. And not for nothing, the Bears haven't faced too many high-end receivers. Christian Kirk last week. He did face Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, but in a very inept offense in Tennessee. So Terry McLaurin is definitely one in which you feel like is going to be the toughest one just because of how he's played this season in this offense. But it will also come down to through throwing him the football. If it's Marcus Mariota, will we see as many deep shots as we've seen with Jaden Daniels under center? So that's a huge question, and that could swing the momentum in Johnson's favor, but it's still a matchup of intrigue here, and the only one, in fact, that I believe has happened before. So I do feel like Terry McLaurin I will give the slight edge to in this one, but it's something to monitor if Mariota ends up being the starter this week. But it's still an exciting one, nevertheless. The second one I want to discuss is the first one that hasn't happened before, and is a very telling matchup here for how this game could go and how the trajectory of these respective team seasons could go, so to speak. Jamar Chase going up against Quinyon Mitchell. This is the first time, of course, as Quinyon Mitchell is a rookie, that these two have faced off, and hopefully it won't be the last, even though they are in different conferences. But I think what I mean when I say the trajectory of these respective team seasons will be drastically altered through the winner of this matchup is because if Jamar Chase wins this matchup, I feel like it proves that the Bengals are not a fluke through the 3-game winning streak. I feel like the Bengals offense has been one of the more underrated over the past 3 weeks of the season, and Jamar Chase has been the key to that success. That deep ball connection between him and Joe Burrow is one of the best ones in the league, and it's going to threaten a young rookie corner in Quinyon Mitchell more than he's ever been threatened before. But give him his due here. If he does win this matchup, which he's certainly capable of, one of the better corners in this year's draft class, I do feel like the Eagles are justified in what they're doing defensively in, trying to still have the experience of guys like Slay in that secondary, and also incorporating a youthful vibrancy with guys like DeJean, guys like Blankenship, who's still only 25, guys like Mitchell. And it really will prove, most importantly, that there's a place for the Philadelphia Eagles sort of complementary style of defense in the league. And I do feel like Jamar Chase is someone who is just too versatile in how he can help Joe Burrow. But Quinyon Mitchell is someone who I believe in these matchups down the road will gain much needed experience through his play with established veterans and will learn how to take on these matchups through that much needed experience. And in the future, potentially a couple years down the road, if they ever face each other again, he might come out on top in this matchup. So this is an interesting matchup for the future of these two players, these two teams, these two seasons in a monumental fashion. The third one, though, that I want to talk about, we talked about this guy a little bit earlier, Brian Thomas Jr. going up against Eric Stokes. And this is a matchup that I don't believe will happen that often because it will depend on where the Jacksonville Jags align Brian Thomas. But he is someone who I feel like will need to take advantage of the weaknesses in the Packers secondary. And if there's any weaknesses, it lies in Eric Stokes. Definitely not the best coverage guy. So if the Jags can exploit that, give Trevor Lawrence time in the pocket, we'll see a lot of deep shots for Jacksonville this week. But then on the defensive side of things, I think there are ways to account for some of Stokes' ineptitudes in terms of disguised coverages. I do feel like what I love about Jeff Hafley is that he's not overly reliant on his secondary. He knows that the front can get pressure on the QB. And so, looking at this matchup, yes, it is kind of scary to contemplate if that Lawrence and Thomas connection gets going. But I still favor not just, Eric Stokes in a weird way because we have to talk about him in this matchup, but the Packers secondary. I just feel like the strength of that secondary alone allows for it to compensate for the weaknesses in this team, in the structure. So I don't necessarily think this first-time matchup is one that has this certain gravitas to it, or in many ways that much importance, but it's still one in which 1v1 looks like a mismatch because of the overall play of that unit for the Packers could be brought into light if Trevor Lawrence and Thomas want to develop that connection in this game early and often. So I don't really know how to describe how I feel about this game, but it's one in which I feel like we're going to take more stock on the offensive side of things than the defensive side of things, because it's all about, like I said, that Lawrence Thomas connection. And if it's not going in this game, I don't think it will be going in many more games, as the Jags have one of the toughest stretches. Let me pull it up, actually, to kind of hammer home the importance of trying to develop this QB wide receiver conversation. They play the Packers, the Eagles, the Vikings, the Jags. They play the Lions, the Jags, and the Texans in the next 5 weeks. So that is a tough gauntlet of tough defenses, and you need some kind of development in this relationship between these two guys to become a positive factor for this team going forward, or the season will fall even more off the rails if that is in play here. But it's just something to monitor as well. And then the final matchup that I want to go over, again, one that I don't necessarily expect to be as flashy as I initially thought, but one to still keep in the back of your mind. Davante Adams going up against Christian Gonzalez. Now, this matchup, I feel like, is one highly contingent on the makeup of the Jets' offense and how it plays week in, week out against different teams. I feel like against far superior defenses, much like what would happen with the Steelers, they're going to struggle. And I feel like if they don't continue trying to evolve Breece Hall in this offense, then I feel like the ineptitudes of the passing attack will rear their ugly heads. And I feel like this Adams trade was more of a panic than a great pickup, because of the fact that, there's already this tension, already this disconnect between Rodgers and the previous star players who were already there for him in Hall and Wilson. And I don't necessarily think that will be too much of a problem. The problem will be, can Aaron Rodgers keep up with trying to incorporate new things and new ideas to really make everyone happy? Because I do feel like at this point, it's Rodgers' team to do with what he wants in some regards. And so if he doesn't, start realizing, well, okay, they can bring in as many players for me as they like, but I've really got to decide whether or not this offense has any juice to it, then I really can't say. But this particular matchup is one that's really intriguing because Christian Gonzalez has faced a lot of high-end receivers this year, held up admirably in a lot of his matchups. Someone who came back from injury, missed most of his rookie season last year due to a torn ACL, and is someone who I really admire for his aggression in what's looking to be a Pats defense with not a lot of hope and optimism surrounding it. In fact, getting called soft by their own coach, his own words, not mine. So I do feel like this matchup is going to go under the radar, but still one that I personally feel like can be a nice little spectacle, if the Jets offense gets right, and if Davante Adams in particular gets right, because he loves to exploit the middle of the field, loves to take advantage of running different routes, and so that could really, hinder Christian Gonzalez's development here, but it's all dependent on what the Jets bring. But that should just about do it. Let me know what you think in the comments about this show and this past segment. But other than that, this has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. If you want more content as this or want to look into more podcasts here on the network, consider liking, following, and subscribing to both the show and the network. A great way to interact with all of us here at the network. But if you want to interact more directly with certain shows, continue doing what you're doing, making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact. Greatly appreciated by all. But other than that, same time as always tomorrow with another great show, 3:30 p.m. Eastern. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in. I am out.